The rain was a cold, cruel lover. It slicked the silk of the wedding dress to her skin, turning the pristine white to a translucent gray, heavy with shame and water. Each drop that landed on her bare shoulders felt like a tiny accusation. The streetlights of this forgotten corner of the city bled into shimmering, distorted pools on the wet asphalt, a watercolor painting of her own personal hell. She was sitting on the stone steps of a church she would never enter as a bride, the voluminous skirt of her gown puddled around her like a defeated cloud. The mascara she'd so carefully applied hours ago, the waterproof kind that was meant to withstand tears of joy, was no match for the deluge of grief that racked her body. Her name was Chloe, and her life had ended 27 minutes ago. It ended not with a bang, but with a simple, sterile text message from Julian's best man. "He's not coming.
I'm sorry. Sorry."
The word was a pathetic little bandage on a gaping, mortal wound. She had stared at the screen, the organ music swelling inside the church, until the letters blurred into meaningless shapes. Then she had walked out the heavy oak doors, past the confused faces of her family and friends, and down the steps into the waiting arms of the storm. She didn't know how long she'd been sitting here, only that the cold had seeped deep into her bones, a lethargy that felt terrifyingly close to acceptance. A sound cut through the rhythmic drumming of the rain, the soft, deliberate crunch of expensive leather shoes on wet pavement. Chloe didn't look up. It was probably a concerned passerby, someone who would offer a useless platitude before hurrying on their way. She didn't want pity. She wanted the world to swallow her whole. The shoes stopped directly in front of her. They were black, polished to a mirror shine despite the weather, the kind of shoes that cost more than her first car. Her gaze traveled slowly upward, over the impeccably tailored trousers of a dark gray suit, the fabric shedding water as if it were an insult. A long, black wool coat was draped over a broad frame. She saw strong, elegant hands, one holding a large black umbrella that now shielded her from the worst of the downpour. She finally forced her eyes to his face. He was Korean, his features sharp and unforgiving as shards of obsidian. His black hair was slicked back, not a strand out of place. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, so dark they seemed to drink the meager light from the street lamps, and they were fixed on her with an unnerving, analytical stillness. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her like a strategist studying a map, like a predator assessing a new and interesting creature in its territory. He said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the rain drumming on the umbrella above them. He was waiting. For what, she didn't know. "Are you going to say something, or just stand there?" The words came out raspy, torn from her throat. A corner of his perfect mouth tilted, a ghost of a smirk. "I was admiring the spectacle," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that seemed to vibrate in the damp air. Julian Kong has always had a flair for the dramatic. The name hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs.
Julian.
How did this stranger know Julian's name? Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the fog of her misery. This wasn't a random Good Samaritan. This was something else. Something dangerous. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to inject a strength she did not feel into her voice. He ignored her question. He chose a public humiliation. A foolish move. It shows weakness, not strength. The man's gaze swept over her, from the damp curls clinging to her forehead to the ruined hem of her dress. He left a valuable asset out in the rain. Another foolish move. Chloe pushed herself to her feet, the wet fabric of the dress clinging and heavy. She was trembling from cold or fear. She couldn't tell. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not an asset. I'm a person." "In our world," he said, his eyes locking with hers, "the two are often the same thing." He took a half step closer, and she could smell it then, the scent of expensive cologne, something with notes of cedar and smoke, and underneath it, the clean, metallic scent of the rain itself. "My name is Min Yoongi, and your fiancé's mistakes are my opportunities." Min Yoongi. The name echoed in the hollow chambers of her memory. Julian had mentioned him once, his voice tight with a mixture of hatred and grudging respect. the head of the Golden Dragon Syndicate. Julian's chief rival in a world she had tried very hard not to understand, a world of shadows and violence that Julian had assured her she would never have to touch. And here it was, standing in front of her, holding an umbrella over her head. "You have two choices, Chloe," Yoongi said, his use of her name sending a fresh shiver down her spine. "You can stay here on the steps of this church until you catch pneumonia or one of Julian's men finds you and cleans up his mess. Or you can come with me." It wasn't a choice. It was a threat wrapped in the guise of a rescue. Her mind raced. Julian had left her, humiliated her, thrown her away like garbage. His men would not be coming to comfort her. They would be coming to silence her, to erase the evidence of their boss's dishonor. And this man, this cold, calculating enemy of her enemy, was offering what? Sanctuary? A cage. She looked into his unreadable eyes. There was no warmth there, no compassion. There was only a calm, chilling certainty. Survival instinct, raw and primal, screamed at her. The world she knew was gone. This was the new world. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help me?" "Because you are now the most public symbol of Julian Kang's failure," Yoongi stated, as if explaining a simple business transaction. "And I collect things that my enemies discard. Especially when they are beautiful and potentially useful," he extended a hand. It was not a gesture of comfort, but of command.
Come.
She stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath that felt like the last gasp of her old life, she placed her cold, trembling fingers into his warm, steady palm. His grip was firm, absolute. He pulled her gently toward him, under the full protection of the umbrella, and led her away from the church, away from the life she was supposed to have. The rain washed away the last of her tears. She didn't look back. That was the moment everything changed. He led her to a black sedan, the kind that whispered of power and anonymity, its engine humming silently at the curb. A driver in a dark suit opened the rear door, without a word. Yoongi guided her inside, the ruined silk of her dress whispering against the plush leather seats. He slid in beside her, and the door closed with a solid, final thud, sealing them in a world of quiet luxury and unspoken menace. The car pulled away from the curb, its tires hissing on the wet streets. Chloe stared out the tinted window at the blurred city lights, her reflection a ghostly bride trapped in the glass. She felt him watching her, his presence a heavy weight in the small space. He took her to a penthouse that sat atop the city, like a king's throne. The elevator opened directly into a sprawling living space of glass, steel, and dark wood. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of the storm-lashed city below, a kingdom of glittering lights laid at their feet. It was beautiful and terrifying. A gilded cage. A silent, older woman appeared, bowed to Yoongi, and then led Chloe to a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment. A hot shower was waiting, along with a simple silk robe laid out on the bed. Chloe stripped off the cold, heavy wedding dress, leaving it in a heap on the marble floor of the bathroom, a white carcass of a dream. The hot water stung her frozen skin, but it felt like a baptism, washing away the girl who had cried on the church steps. When she emerged, wrapped in the robe, Yoongi was waiting in the suite's sitting area. He stood by the window, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He had shed his coat, and the white shirt he wore was tailored perfectly to his frame. "Julian Kang made a mistake today," he said, his back still to her as he gazed out at the city. "He didn't just abandon a bride. He left a weapon behind. And I always pick up what my enemies discard." Chloe cinched the belt of her robe tighter. "I'm not a weapon." He turned then, his dark eyes pinning her in place. "Aren't you? You know his habits, his routines, his vanities. You were to be his wife. You saw the man behind the carefully constructed image. To him, that knowledge makes you a threat. To me, it makes you an asset." That was the hook. She wasn't just a rescued damsel. She was a strategic piece in a war she hadn't known she was a part of. And he, Min Yoongi, was now her general. The morning brought a fragile, watery sunlight that did little to warm the sterile perfection of the penthouse. Chloe woke up in a bed that felt like sleeping on a cloud, the city waking up silently below her. The reality of her situation settled in, cold and hard. She was a prisoner, a well-cared-for one, but a prisoner nonetheless. She wandered the vast apartment, a ghost in borrowed silk pajamas. She saw the men, stationed discreetly near the entrances, all dressed in dark suits, all moving with a quiet, disciplined purpose. They were soldiers, and this was their fortress. Yoongi was in his office, a room lined with books and dominated by a massive mahogany desk. He was on the phone, speaking in rapid, low Korean. His voice was different now, sharper, colder, the voice of a commander issuing orders. Chloe watched him from the doorway, unseen. He moved like the room owed him space. He radiated an authority that was absolute and unquestionable. This was who he really was, the head of an empire built on shadows. Days bled into a week. Yoongi was a constant, distant presence. He provided her with clothes, food, anything she could possibly need, but he kept his distance. He was observing her, she realized, testing her, seeing if she would break. She refused to give him the satisfaction. She ate the food, wore the clothes, and met his gaze across the dinner table with a cool resolve she hadn't known she possessed. She was a survivor. Julian had tried to break her, and he had failed. Min Yoongi would not succeed where he had. One evening, she found him in his office long after midnight. He was staring at a small, silver frame on his desk, his expression unguarded for the first time. Chloe hesitated in the doorway, but something compelled her to speak. "You can't sleep either?" He looked up, his mask of cool indifference snapping back into place, but not before she saw the flicker of pain in his eyes. He didn't answer her question. He simply nodded toward the chair opposite his desk. An invitation. She sat down, her gaze falling on the photograph. It was of a young woman with a bright, beautiful smile, her eyes full of life. She looked happy.
Carefree.
"She was my younger sister," Yoongi said, his voice quiet. He didn't look at the photo, but at some distant point beyond the window. Her name was Minjun. Chloe waited, sensing there was more. "She fell in love with a man I warned her about, a lieutenant from a rival family. She believed he was different, that their love could bridge the gap between our worlds." He picked up the glass of whiskey from his desk, swirling the contents. "He used her. He used her trust to get close to my father. The night he made his move, she was caught in the crossfire. He took a slow drink. She trusted the wrong person. A mistake I will not allow to be made again." It wasn't the whole story, she knew, but it was a piece of him, a wound, the source of the cold, hard wall he built around himself. He failed to protect someone he loved, and he had been paying the price ever since. In his own way, he was telling her why he was so cautious, so controlling. He was telling her he would not let her be another Minjun. The fragile peace of their strange cohabitation was shattered a few days later. One of Yoongi's men reported seeing Julian's enforcers casing the building. They weren't trying to be subtle. It was a message. Julian knew where she was. Her presence here was no longer a secret asset. It was a direct challenge, a spark thrown into a barrel of gunpowder. That night, Yoongi summoned her to his office. "I can get you out of the city," he said, his tone flat, all business. "A new identity, a new life. Far away from here. Far away from me and Julian. You would be safe." It was an out. A real one. She could take it. She could disappear and leave this world of violence and danger behind forever. She could go back to being ordinary. But she hesitated. She thought of Julian's cruelty, of the casual way he had discarded her. He wouldn't let her go. He would hunt her down, not out of love, but to reclaim his property and silence his shame. Her old life was gone, and there was no going back. Then she thought of Yoongi, the quiet protector, the man who saw steel in her where everyone else saw a broken doll. Staying here was dangerous, but leaving felt like a betrayal. Not of him, but of herself, of the person she was becoming. She met his gaze, her own clear and steady. "I'm not going anywhere." Surprise flickered in his dark eyes, a genuine, unguarded reaction. He had expected her to run. "This is my fight now, too," she said, the words feeling truer than anything she had said in years. "He didn't just humiliate me. He tried to erase me. I won't let him." She had made a deliberate choice.
She chose to stay.
She chose this dangerous, uncertain life with him. Later that week, the threat became real. Yoongi returned to the penthouse late, long after the city had gone to sleep. Chloe was in the living room, unable to rest, reading a book under a single lamp. The elevator doors opened, and he stepped out, leaning heavily against the wall. His suit jacket was gone, his white shirt was torn at the sleeve, and blood, dark and stark, was blooming through the fabric of his left arm. Her heart leaped into her throat. She was on her feet before she even registered the decision, rushing to his side. "What happened?" "A business disagreement," he gritted out, a line of pain etched beside his mouth. His men were already moving, securing the apartment, their faces grim. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice firm. She helped him to the sofa, her hands gentle on his good arm. He sank onto the cushions, his usual iron control wavering. She ran to the guest bathroom, her mind clear and focused. She grabbed the first aid kit she'd seen under the sink. When she returned, he was watching her, his expression unreadable. She knelt before him, opening the kit. "Take off your shirt," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then complied, shrugging out of the ruined garment with a wince. The cut was long and deep, from his shoulder down his bicep. Not a bullet wound. A knife. It was bleeding sluggishly. Chloe took a deep breath, pushing down the tremor in her hands. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic, her touch surprisingly steady. He hissed as the liquid stung, his muscles tensing under her fingers. "Sorry," she murmured. "Don't be," he said, his voice low. They were inches apart. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, see the faint, silvery lines of older scars tracing paths across his chest and shoulders. A map of a violent life. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the soft dab of the cotton against his skin. She worked with quiet concentration, her entire world narrowing to this single, intimate task. She was tending to his wound. She was mending him. When she finished dressing the injury, her fingers lingered for a moment on the clean, white bandage. She finally looked up and found his eyes on her. He wasn't looking at his arm. He was looking at her face, his gaze intense, searching. It was a look that stripped away the roles they had been playing, Mafia boss and abandoned bride, and left only a man and a woman, bound together by danger in the dead of night. He said her name, just her name, Chloe, and the way he said it was different than anyone else ever had. It was not a question or a statement, but a claim. A quiet acknowledgement of the line they had just crossed. The next morning, the war escalated. Julian, unable to reclaim Chloe physically, decided to destroy her reputation. A story broke in the city's most notorious gossip column, complete with tearful quotes from Julian's mother. It painted Chloe as a manipulative gold digger who had gotten cold feet, running away from the altar and humiliating the noble Kong family. It was a vicious, calculated lie designed to isolate her, to make her a villain in her own tragedy. Yoongi didn't hide it from her. He laid the tablet on the coffee table in front of her, the article glowing on the screen. He watched her as she read, his face a stony mask. She felt a surge of white-hot fury, so intense it burned away the last vestiges of her grief. Julian hadn't just broken her heart. He was now trying to salt the earth of her entire past. "He won't get away with this," she said, her voice low and tight with rage. Her alliance with Yoongi, born of necessity, now solidified into a shared purpose. Vengeance. The attack came a week later. They were in the car, moving through the neon-drenched streets of Koreatown after a late dinner at a restaurant Yoongi owned. Chloe was watching the city lights blur past when Yoongi suddenly stiffened beside her. "Down," he barked. Before she could process the command, he was moving. He threw himself over her, his body a solid, unyielding shield, crushing her into the leather seat. The world erupted in a cacophony of shattering glass and the percussive roar of gunfire. The back window exploded inward, spraying the cabin with glittering shards. The car swerved violently as Yoongi's driver fought for control. Beneath him, Chloe was pinned, her face pressed against the cool fabric of his suit. She could feel the thunder of his heart against her back, smell the gunpowder and his cologne. His focus was absolute. He had a gun in his hand, seemingly from nowhere, and was firing back through the shattered window with a calm, lethal precision. It was over in seconds. The squeal of tires faded into the distance. Their car shuddered to a stop. Silence descended, thick and suffocating, punctuated by the tinkling of broken glass. "Are you hurt?" Yoongi's voice was rough, close to her ear. She shook her head, unable to speak. He slowly pushed himself off her, his eyes scanning every inch of her, searching for injury. He was covered in a fine layer of dust and glass, a small cut bleeding on his cheekbone. Seeing him like that, seeing the evidence of the violence that had just grazed them, sent a wave of pure, unadulterated terror through her. But the fear wasn't just for herself anymore. It was for him. The thought of him being hurt, of losing him, was a physical ache in her chest. That night, they brought one of the captured shooters to a secure warehouse on the industrial outskirts of the city. Chloe insisted on coming. She didn't want to hide in the penthouse anymore. She needed to face this world head-on. The man was tied to a chair, defiant and bleeding. Yoongi interrogated him in Korean, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, which made his words all the more terrifying. The man spat on the floor, then switched to English, his eyes finding Chloe where she stood in the shadows. "Look at you," he sneered, a bloody grin splitting his lip. Hiding behind him. "Julian was right to dump you. Used goods." A red haze descended over Chloe's vision. Before Yoongi or his men could react, she walked out of the shadows and into the harsh light illuminating the captive. Her movements were calm, deliberate. She circled the chair, her eyes never leaving the man's face. On a nearby crate, a letter opener used for slicing open packages lay glinting under the bare bulb. She picked it up. The cold, heavy steel felt right in her hand. She didn't brandish it. She didn't threaten. She simply stopped behind the man and held the point of the opener against the soft, vulnerable skin of his throat. He froze, his eyes wide. "Tell him what he wants to know," she said, her voice a quiet, chilling whisper that cut through the silence of the warehouse. "Or the next person Julian loses won't be his bride." It was a bluff. She didn't know if she could do it, but in that moment, she believed she could. The man swallowed hard, the movement slick against the steel tip. He started talking, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. Chloe stepped back, placing the letter opener back on the crate, as if it were nothing. The room was silent. Yoongi's men stared at her with a new, profound respect. She looked at Yoongi. His dark eyes were burning with an intensity she had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was something else. Something that looked like pride. She had just crossed a line she could never uncross, stepping fully out of her old world and into his. She felt no regret, only a sense of terrifying, exhilarating power. Later, back at the penthouse, the adrenaline had faded, leaving her feeling hollowed out and shaky. She stood on the balcony, the cool night air a balm on her skin, the city a galaxy of indifferent lights below. She heard him approach, his footsteps silent on the stone. He came to stand beside her, not speaking for a long time. The silence between them was not empty. "You surprised me today," he finally said, his voice a low rumble beside her. "I surprised myself," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He was quiet for another moment. "Julian saw you as a prize," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "An ornament to decorate his arm and warm his bed." He never saw the steel underneath. He turned his head, his profile sharp against the city glow. His loss. It was not a declaration of love. It was something deeper, more significant in their world. It was a confession of sight. He saw her, the real her, the one forged in betrayal and fire. That acknowledgement was more intimate than any kiss. The enemy, realizing she was no longer a weakness, but a strength at Yoongi's side, changed tactics. The next day, a package arrived for Chloe. Inside was a single photograph. It was of her mother's small, tidy house in the suburbs, the one Chloe had grown up in. A large, crudely painted red X was smeared across the front door. There was no note. None was needed. Julian was no longer targeting Yoongi's territory. He was targeting her heart. The war had just become deeply, irrevocably personal. The photograph of her mother's house changed everything. The fight was no longer about revenge for her own humiliation. It was about protecting the only family she had left. Yoongi saw the shift in her, the cold fury that replaced her fear. He doubled the security around her mother's home, his men becoming invisible shadows in her quiet suburban neighborhood, but they both knew it was a temporary measure. Julian had to be eliminated, not just his power, but his presence. Yoongi began to orchestrate a final confrontation, a meticulously planned trap designed to dismantle Julian's operations from the inside out. He gathered his lieutenants, spreading out blueprints and surveillance photos on the vast dining table that had become their war room. Chloe watched, listened, and learned. She absorbed the details of their world, the language of power and violence, the cold logic of strategy. One evening, as Yoongi was outlining the plan to corner Julian at a clandestine arms deal, Chloe spoke up. "It won't work." The room went silent. All eyes turned to her. Yoongi's face remained impassive, but he tilted his head, a silent command for her to explain. "You're planning this like Julian is a rational actor," she said, stepping forward and pointing to a location on the map. "You think he'll cut his losses and retreat when cornered. He won't. Julian's greatest weakness isn't greed. It's his ego. He cannot stand to be seen as weak or foolish, especially not in front of me." She looked directly at Yoongi. "He won't go to the arms deal himself. He'll send his second-in-command. He's too paranoid. But I know where he will be." She tapped a different location on the map, a private, high-stakes gambling den in the basement of a luxury hotel. "He goes there every Thursday night. Not for the money, but to be seen, to hold court. He needs the adoration. If you want him, you have to hit him where his pride lives." She paused, taking a deep breath. "And I have to be there." Yoongi's expression hardened.
No.
"It's too dangerous." "It's the only way it will work," she insisted, her voice ringing with conviction. "He needs to see me with you. It will enrage him, make him reckless. That's when you'll have him. If I'm not there, he'll smell a trap. With me there, he'll see an opportunity to humiliate you both." She was no longer just an asset. She was a strategist. She was using the very thing Julian had tried to destroy her with, their shared past, as a weapon against him. Yoongi stared at her for a long, tense moment. He saw the fire in her eyes, the unshakable resolve. He was a man who respected strength, and she was radiating it. He gave a single, sharp nod. "All right. We do it your way." The night of the confrontation, the air in the penthouse was thick with tension. Chloe dressed not in the soft silks Yoongi had provided, but in a severe, elegant black dress that was both armor and statement. When she emerged, Yoongi was waiting. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, his presence filling the room. He looked at her, and for a moment, the Mafia boss was gone, and there was only a man, his eyes dark with a concern he could not voice. He held out a hand, and she took it. Their fingers interlaced, a silent pact. The gambling den was a den of quiet, expensive ice. The air smelled of cigar smoke and aged whiskey. When Yoongi and Chloe entered, a hush fell over the room. Julian was at the main baccarat table, a beautiful woman on his arm. He looked up, and his face went through a rapid series of emotions: shock, disbelief, and then a dark, possessive fury as he saw Chloe's hand resting confidently in Yoongi's. The trap was sprung. Yoongi's men, who had entered as high-rolling guests, moved with surgical precision, securing the exits. The gamblers scrambled for cover. It was suddenly just the three of them in the center of the opulent room, a triangle of hatred and betrayal. "Chloe," Julian said, his voice dangerously soft as he rose to his feet. What is this? Did he force you? Yoongi moved to stand slightly in front of her, a protective gesture, but Chloe placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. This was her part to play. He didn't force me to do anything, Julian, she said, her voice steady. Julian's face twisted into a sneer. So you run from my altar into his bed? I knew you were cheap. The insult didn't land. It was the desperate jab of a man who had already lost. In the chaos, however, Julian was faster than they anticipated. He pulled a small, silver pistol from an ankle holster, leveling it at Yoongi's chest. You think you've won? He snarled at Yoongi. She was mine first. She'll be mine last. Time seemed to slow down. Yoongi's men had their weapons trained on Julian, but it was a stalemate. One wrong move, and Yoongi was dead. Julian's eyes flicked to Chloe, his expression shifting to one of faux concern. Come back to me, Chloe.
This isn't you.
Leave him. We can go back to how it was. This was her moment. Instead of freezing, she acted. She let a look of fear and confusion cross her face, playing the part he always expected of her. Julian, you're right, she whispered, her voice trembling. I was scared. I made a mistake. She took a hesitant step toward him, away from Yoongi. Julian's ego flared. He was winning her back. A smug smile touched his lips, his attention momentarily diverted to his victory. It was the only opening Yoongi needed. In a blur of motion, he lunged forward, deflecting Julian's arm upwards as the gun fired harmlessly into the ornate ceiling. The sound was deafening. He disarmed Julian with brutal efficiency, and in seconds it was over. Julian was on his knees, his face a mask of disbelief. Yoongi's men surrounding him. The fight was over. Julian's empire would crumble by morning. Yoongi ignored the chaos, the shouting, the securing of his rival. He turned to Chloe, his eyes scanning her, his hands coming up to frame her face, checking for any sign of injury. They were gentle, his touch a stark contrast to the violence that had just unfolded. He looked into her eyes, and the whole world seemed to fade away. You are not a weapon, he said, his voice low and raw, a direct contradiction to the first real words he had ever spoken to her. You are the queen, it was his ultimate acknowledgement. Not of her usefulness, but of her worth, of her place by his side. The cost of their victory was paid in blood and sacrifice. Yoongi had taken a graze from a stray bullet along his ribs during the final scuffle, a thin red line that would become a permanent scar, a reminder of the night. And Chloe, for the safety of her mother, had to make the hardest phone call of her life, telling her she was going away, that she couldn't come back, fabricating a story of a new life abroad. She severed the last tie to her old world, the price of admission into this new one. It was a heavy cost, but a choice she made with open eyes. Days later, they stood on the penthouse balcony, the city quiet and serene below them. The storm, both literal and metaphorical, had passed. Yoongi came to stand behind her, his presence a solid, comforting wall at her back. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the warmth of him, the energy that bound them together. She was no longer the crying girl in the ruined wedding dress. She wore a dark, elegant gown of her own choosing, the uniform of her new reality. She thought of the woman she had been, naive and trusting. She did not mourn her. She had been forged into someone stronger in the wreckage of that life. Chloe reached back, her hand searching for his. He met her touch instantly, his strong fingers lacing through hers, a perfect fit. Their kingdom stretched out before them, built on the ashes of an enemy's pride and the foundation of their shared survival. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something far more real, more dangerous, and more profound.
It was a choice.
She was not a bride abandoned. She was a queen, and she was finally home.